it appears that the Pakistanis are trying to get something started next week where Pakistan serves as a mediator between Iran and the United States. But I think this is really going nowhere. The Americans want a ceasefire, and the Iranians would be crazy to agree to a ceasefire, and they're not going to do that. And then when you get down to real negotiations that are designed to settle this conflict, it's impossible to see how you get a deal. This situation, by the way, is analogous to the whole question of whether you can get a ceasefire in Ukraine and whether you can have a meaningful peace agreement. You can't do it in Ukraine, and I don't see how you can do it here. I mean, if you look at, just let's take Iran. Look at Iran's demands on one side, and then look at the concessions that the United States and Israel are expecting the Iranians to accept. And when you look at those two sides of the equation, there's just no way you get a deal here, right? The Iranians are really playing hardball in terms of their demands. They want all U.S. military forces and installations out of the Middle East. They want reparations. They want sanctions relief, so forth and so on. Then when you go over to the concession side of the equation, we want them to give up their ballistic missiles. We want them to give up their nuclear enrichment capability. We want them to stop supporting the Houthis, Hezbollah, and Hamas. This is not a set of demands that there's any chance the Iranians would accept. So how do you get a deal here?
I don't know, but here's what the Iranian foreign minister had to say yesterday about the President Trump's claims that negotiations are going on. Chris, number 10.
I don't think the question of talking with Americans or negotiation with Americans once again would be on the table, because we have a very bitter experience of talking with Americans. We negotiated with them last year in last June, and they attacked us in the middle of negotiations. And again this year, they tried to convince us that this time is different. They promised us that they don't have any intention to attack us. And they wanted to resolve Iran's nuclear question peacefully and to find a negotiated solution. And we finally accepted. But again, after 3 rounds of negotiation, and after the American team in the negotiation, said itself that we made a big progress, still they decided to attack us. So I don't think, talking with Americans anymore would be, on our agenda anymore.
I don't think that talking to the Americans anymore would be on our agenda anymore. You can't blame him.
No, there's no question about it. But let me add another dimension to it. Judge, just imagine that you're playing Iran's hand. And the question is, how do you think about prolonging this war? And it seems to me that if you're playing Iran's hand, you don't want the war to end now. You want the war to keep going for the foreseeable future. And the reason is, as the war goes on, the cost that the West is paying for this conflict go up and up and up. And that means that you gain greater leverage. My view is that if there's anything that's going to stop this war, it's going to be a situation where we are on the precipice of a major economic disaster, worldwide economic disaster. That situation will force President Trump to go to the negotiating table and make huge concessions to the Iranians. He'll have no choice. I think that's the only way you get a deal here. Well, if that's the case, and you're the Iranians, you have a vested interest in continuing to inflict pain on the West and really on the entire world, and putting enormous pressure on us, on President Trump, to cut a deal, push us toward the precipice. So I don't see why the Iranians, from a strategic point of view, would agree to cut a deal now.
What would become of Israel if the United States stopped the bombing?
Well, the Israelis won't stop the bombing. And if the Israelis are on their own, what will happen is they will probably go after the energy infrastructure inside of Iran, and the Iranians will respond. And that will push us very close to the precipice, if not over the precipice. So if the United States just pulls out and leaves the Israelis and the Iranians to fight it out between themselves, it's not clear that there'll be a happy ending to that story. And one can tell a story, a very plausible story, where we end up going off the cliff.
Here's a rather glum Prime Minister Netanyahu last night in Jerusalem. Chris, number 9.
Earlier today, I spoke with our friend, President Trump. President Trump believes there is a chance to leverage the tremendous achievements of the IDF and the U.S. military to realize the objectives of the war in an agreement. An agreement that will safeguard our vital interests. At the same time, we continue to strike both in Iran and in Lebanon. We are disrupting the missile program and the thin nuclear program, and we continue to inflict heavy damage on Hezbollah. Just a few days ago, we eliminated 2 more nuclear scientists, and this is only the beginning. We will safeguard our vital interests under any circumstances.
Last thing he wants is for the United States and Iran to enter into some sort of an agreement which stops the U.S. from attacking Iran.
Well, that's true now, but we'll see how this plays out. I was looking at Haaretz this morning, and there were 8 missile barrages from Iran overnight. This is Monday night, Tuesday morning. There were 8 missile barrages from Iran, and there were 2 rocket barrages from Hezbollah in Lebanon. The Israelis are really being pounded, and their missile defenses are clearly not working for whatever reason. And the Iranians have the capability to continue pounding Israel. So we'll see how long Prime Minister Netanyahu wants to continue this war. It's not clear to me that he's going to want to fight a long war with Iran. And by the way, this is why I said if the Israelis are left on their own, they'll go up the escalation ladder and they'll go after energy infrastructure in Iran. And that could lead to real catastrophe really quickly.
What has been the international geopolitical reaction amongst diplomats and heads of state to this war?
Well, I think almost everybody around the world understands that this was a catastrophic mistake by the United States and Israel to start this war. I just saw where the German president said almost exactly that. The Europeans understand that this is a disaster. And of course, all across the global South, there is great consternation about what is going on here, because the cost of food, the cost of oil, the cost of gas and diesel is going to go up significantly over time. It's only going to get worse. And this is going to have disastrous economic and political consequences for countries all over the world. Furthermore, all those leaders and many of the people in those countries understand that there is no quick and easy solution to this problem. It looks like it's just going to go on, and their situations are going to get worse. So if you look at what people around the world are thinking about what President Trump did and what Prime Minister Netanyahu did, I think that most people think this was a remarkably foolish move that is going to have significantly negative consequences for them.
Trump does not have a face-saving off-ramp right now, does he?
No, no. If he did, he would take it. Again, it's very important to understand that the Iranians have a vested interest in continuing this war, because the longer the war goes on, the more leverage they have. Look at President Trump today compared to what situation he was in 3 days after the war started. 3 days after the war started, he thought he was in the catbird seat. He doesn't think he's in the catbird seat now. He knows he is in deep trouble, and he's looking for a way out. But there is no off-ramp. And a lot of that, as I said, has to do with the fact that the Iranians understand that they hold most of the cards at this point, and it's in their interest to continue the war.
When he says that the United States and Iran have engaged in productive negotiations, do you think he's lying? He's making this up just to move the markets?
Well, he definitely is making this up. There's no question about that. And I understand the market's argument, and I'm sure there's some truth in that. But I think more importantly, he just didn't want to have to attack Iran on Monday night. This would have led to catastrophe, because what Iran was talking about doing was basically destroying the Gulf states. Very important to understand that. They said, the Iranians said, that if the United States and Israel attacked their energy infrastructure, they would retaliate not only by going after energy infrastructure in the Gulf states, but they go after the desalination plants as well. They would have wrecked these societies. It would have been catastrophic. And furthermore, the consequences for the international economy would have been disastrous. So President Trump would have been, in my opinion, out of his mind to start a war on Iran's energy infrastructure on Monday night. And I think that's why he changed the rhetoric. And let's hope at the end of 5 days, he has the same basic attitude and doesn't tend to attack that energy infrastructure after 5 days, because this, again, would lead to disaster. Let me make one more quick point here. One thing that really matters when countries get into war and you think about escalation is just how desperate they are. And what really worries me about President Trump is that he's getting into a desperate situation. Despite the positive face that he puts on every day when he gets out in public, he has to know behind closed doors that he is in deep, deep trouble. And I would imagine that the level of desperation goes up every day. And when countries get desperate, you do not want to underestimate the extent to which they're willing to roll the dice and pursue policies that stand very little chance of succeeding, and indeed could lead to disaster. But nevertheless, the leaders feel that they're in a position where they have no choice. This, by the way, is what happened to the Japanese with regard to the attack on Pearl Harbor. The Japanese were in a desperate situation. They understood full well that it was likely to end in catastrophe, but nevertheless, they rolled the dice, and they did it because they were desperate. So people want to understand, despite all the positive words and all the tough words that you hear from President Trump every day, behind closed doors, he fully understands that he is in really deep trouble, that he made a huge mistake. And that makes me very nervous because, again, there's lots of evidence when leaders are desperate, they do foolish things.
Is he compounding that mistake by introducing ground troops? I mean, we don't know how many. The number started out at 5,000. It now appears close to 50,000 American infantry, Army, and Marines are on their way to the Middle East.
Yeah, I think this is evidence of how desperate he is, right? Because he would have never countenanced a ground invasion before the war. The problem he faces is that there's no good military option for using those ground forces. I mean, for example, there's all this talk about invading and taking Karg Island. It's hard to see, number one, how you get to Karg Island. It's number two, it's hard to see how you conquer Karg Island without lots of casualties. Number three, it's hard to see how you hold on to it once the Iranians realize you're there and they zero their artillery and rockets and ballistic missiles on top of your troops. And then finally, let's assume that we take Karg Island. It's ours. We control it. Tell me the story about how that leads to a happy ending. Do people really think the Iranians are then going to roll over and play dead? I would not bet any money on that. So that's not going to work. And then there's all this talk about, inserting forces into the middle of Iran to rescue that highly enriched uranium. The chances of that succeeding are about zero. And then we're not going to invade the whole country. Have you ever looked at how big that country is? And they have 93 million people. There's just no way you can do that. We would need an army of about 2 million men and women to do that. And that's not happening. So I don't think there is a ground forces option here that is a viable one. But again, he may be desperate enough that he'll try.
Yeah, this brings us back to where we started. How precarious is the U.S. position? Extremely precarious, based in large measure. I invite your comments on this, on the U.S.'s failure to appreciate Iranian resistance, failure to understand the asymmetrical nature of Iranians' military response, failure to appreciate the underground silos that Iran has, which are impervious to U.S. and Israeli attack.
I think everything you say is correct. Again, it gets back to that simple point that I made that, we thought we would win a quick and decisive victory. This is what David Barnea, the head of Mossad, convinced Netanyahu and Trump would happen. And once that doesn't happen, you're into a war of attrition. This is like the Soviet Union and Germany, Nazi Germany in World War II. The Wehrmacht invades on June 22nd, 1941. They think they're going to win a quick and decisive victory. The German troops going into the Soviet Union in June 41 don't even have winter clothing. They think it's going to be quick and easy. And that does not prove to be the case, thankfully. And the Wehrmacht is stopped outside the gates of Moscow on December 8th, 1941. And they are in a war of attrition. And by April of 1945, the Red Army is in Berlin and Germany is about to be finished off. So if you don't win a quick and decisive victory and you're not prepared for a long war and you get into a long war, you're in real trouble. And that's what's happened to us. And then you just factor in all the points that you made and you can just see how bad off we are.
In Iran, in this Iran conflict, as we speak, Professor Mearsheimer?
Well, it's remarkably precarious because we had assumed that we were going to win a quick and decisive victory. And once we didn't do that and we ended up in a long war, we found ourselves in a situation where it's the Iranians who hold most of the cards, not us. And there's nothing President Trump can do to escalate this crisis that works to our advantage. In fact, it works to Iran's advantage. And at the same time, it's hard to see where there is a viable off-ramp. So he's stuck, which is another way of saying we're stuck in a war that we can't win and that has the potential to do enormous damage to the international economy.
What became of the bill of goods that Netanyahu and his aides apparently sold to Trump, that a quick decapitation of Iranian leadership would result in mass chaos and revolution in the streets, and they would take over the government?
Yeah, the New York Times had a fascinating article 2 days ago that laid out in detail how the head of Mossad, a man named David Barnea, convinced Netanyahu, as well as the Trump administration, that once we decapitated the regime, that what would happen is that there would be a mass uprising in Iran. The regime would be overthrown, and we would, in effect, win a quick and decisive victory. And it's worth noting that the Times points out that his predecessor, a man named Yossi Cohen, had said that this was a pipe dream. This was not going to happen. But the new head of Mossad did a 180-degree turn and was able to convince both Netanyahu and Trump that we had the magic formula. And of course, he proved wrong. And all I would say is it's quite remarkable that people bought this argument. There's just a huge literature on regime change and coups and so forth and so on that tells you that it was extremely unlikely that this strategy would succeed, as the predecessor at Mossad had understood.
Do you have any indication or feeling of whether President Trump takes into account the advice of the American CIA or the American intelligence community. I realize there's a lot more agencies out there besides the CIA. When it conflicts with the Mossad?
Well, I think, if you look at what the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff was saying before the war, and the military more generally was saying, and what the intelligence community was saying, and this would include the CIA, but especially the reports on what the National Intelligence Council was saying, it's quite clear that there were all sorts of people and institutions inside the deep state who were telling him that this is not a good idea, that we don't have a viable strategy for winning this war. But instead, what he did was, and here we're talking about President Trump, is he listened to the Israelis and he listened to the Zionists in the United States who were pushing him towards war. And this, of course, would include people like General Keane, Lindsey Graham, and his two principal advisors, Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff. So it's that crew inside the United States, plus the Israelis, who were pushing hard for us to get into this war, I think, generally speaking, against the advice of the deep state.
I'm going to guess that Joe Kent, the former director of counterintelligence in the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, Counterterrorism, his title, offered that advice, and it was rejected, and that resulted in his resignation.
Well, he works for Tulsi, or he worked for Tulsi Gabbard, and the National Intelligence Council comes out of Tulsi Gabbard's office. So I would assume that almost all of these people who were working with Tulsi Gabbard were on the same page. And I would imagine that many people in the CIA and in the military understood that this was not a workable scheme, which proved to be the case. Well, it's quite clear that Israel has been trying to drive the United States into a war with Iran for a long time. They've made their interests perfectly clear. This is true of Prime Minister Netanyahu, who has been a huge advocate of sucking the Americans into this war. And he was unable to do that until President Trump came along. And it's quite clear, if you listen to President Trump and you listen to his advisors speak, the Israeli influence and the influence of the lobby on President Trump was enormous. In fact, Secretary of State Rubio effectively said, as did Speaker of the House Mike Johnson, that we went to war because Israel dragged us into this war.
But critics say that this overstates Israel's influence over the United States while understating the United States' influence, which includes military dominance. That's one of the strategic interests, military dominance in the region, access to gas reserves and energy routes. The U.S. was also active in the Middle East long before the Israeli lobby became influential in U.S. politics. What do you say to that?
There's no question that the United States has been deeply interested in the Middle East for a long time, even before Israel was created as a state in 1948. And the principal reason for that was oil. But we're not going to war against Iran because of oil. We're not participating in the genocide against the Palestinians because of oil. This is being largely done as a result of Israel's influence in the United States, which is largely a function of the Israel lobby. The question you want to ask yourself is, if we had a national interest in supporting Israeli policies towards the Palestinians, towards Iran, towards Iraq, and so forth and so on, why would you need a lobby? Why would you need this lobby that, by almost all accounts, is by far the most powerful lobby in the history of the United States? Why do you need it if Israel is basically doing our bidding? The fact is, you have this incredibly powerful lobby because it is not in the American national interest to support Israel in all sorts of its endeavors. There's no question that sometimes we have similar interests. Both the United States and Israel have a vested interest in preventing Iran from getting nuclear weapons. There's no question about that. But on all sorts of issues, like the Palestinian issue and like the question of attacking Iran, America's national interest is at odds with Israel's national interest. There's no way that Iran is a threat to the United States. It isn't. Now, the question you have to ask yourself is, what is the relationship between the United States and Israel going to look like moving forward, especially with regard to ending this war? It's quite clear that we're not going to win this war. That we're not going to cause regime change. And if anything, we're going to push Iran down the road to acquiring a nuclear weapon. And we may even be worse off once this war is over than we are now. And this is going to enrage the Israelis. And the Israelis are going to want to go back at Iran. And the United States is not going to want to do this again. So one can posit a scenario where U.S.-Israeli relations are frayed in serious ways at the end of this conflict. I can't say that will happen for sure. Who knows for sure how this war will end? But the way things are going now, one can tell a story where the Israelis and the Americans end up at loggerheads at the end of the conflict.
It sounds like you're saying the U.S. is not going to achieve its goals in this war. What did you mean by that? And let's remind ourselves, what are the real objectives here? They keep changing. Is it nuclear rollback, regime change, regional dominance? Is it a coherent story of what the goals are?
Well, the story that the administration tells is not coherent because they bounce around from one rationale to another. But the main goal here, for sure, is regime change. Because if you don't get regime change, if you don't put a regime in place that is subservient to the United States and the Israelis, then you can't get Iran to give up its nuclear enrichment capability. You can't get Iran to give up its ballistic missiles, and you can't get Iran to stop supporting the Houthis, Hamas, and Hezbollah. To achieve those particular goals, you need a new regime that will cooperate with the United States and Israel. The administration thought that it could achieve that end, the end of regime change, by decapitating the regime early in the conflict. Well, it decapitated the regime, and the regime remains intact. Now it's punishing the Iranian population. It's hitting all sorts of targets across Iran. And you have to ask yourself whether or not you think this punishment campaign that's now in place is going to produce regime change. And the historical record tells us very clearly that a punishment campaign executed by air power alone has never succeeded in producing regime change. This tells you there is no reason to think that we're going to get regime change in this case with air power alone. We're going to have to put boots on the ground, as we did in Iraq, if we want regime change. And we're not going to put boots on the ground. So I don't see how we end up winning this war. And I don't see anybody who can tell a plausible story about how we get favorable regime change.
So airstrikes alone will not get the United States there. And you're saying that a massive ground invasion is not possible. Yet the White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt declined to rule out the possibility of a military draft if the war escalates. You don't see that?
No, not at all. I mean, we did Afghanistan, we did Iraq. They turned into forever wars. The American populace has no interest in another ground war. You want to remember that when President Trump started this war on February 28th, only 20% of Americans were in favor of the war. This is the first example in our history of where a president took the country into a war where he didn't have public opinion behind him. And the idea that after Iraq and Afghanistan, we're going to invade a country like Iran, which is as big as Western Europe and contains 93 million people, and occupy that country and effect regime change and do social engineering is, in my opinion, not going to happen.
I just want to talk about how President Donald Trump campaigned. He campaigned against forever wars, but recently claimed that the United States could fight wars, I quote, forever because American weapons supplies are virtually unlimited. Yet later, he suggested the Iran war was very complete, pretty much, another direct quote. What do you make of these mixed signals? Is a forever war feasible?
Well, you want to remember that before the war started, General Kane, who President Trump handpicked to be the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, told him that the United States did not have a viable military option in Iran. This is the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And he told him that if we fought a long war in Iran, we would be in serious trouble because we did not have the weapon stocks. We did not have enough sophisticated weapons of a defensive sort and of an offensive sort to wage a long war. So the argument that we have an endless supply of weapons that will allow us to wage a protracted war with Iran is in contradiction to what the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff said. Furthermore, if you look at the Ukraine war, one of the reasons that we were so upset about the fact that we were pouring huge numbers of weapons into the Ukraine war is because we were running down our stocks to dangerous levels. To take this a step further, go to the Pacific. Almost everybody who's looked at what a China-US war over Taiwan would look like understands that after 30 or so days, we would, in good part, run out of sophisticated munitions. So this idea that we have this inventory, this endless inventory of sophisticated weapons that we can use against Iran is simply wrong.
Final question to you. The war with Iran already has a global impact on the economy, the global economy, on diplomacy, on military. What does this mean for countries like Russia and China, non-Western powers? How do they respond to this political moment?
Well, I think if you take the Russians, this war is good news. I mean, as a result of the oil crisis, the Russians are greatly improving their oil sales situation. They're selling more oil than ever, and they're selling that oil at a higher price. So the idea that we, the United States, are going to cripple the Russian economy with sanctions is an argument that basically goes out the window because of this war. If anything, the Russians have a vested interest in seeing this war continue and seeing oil prices rise. They benefit from that. And as far as the war in Ukraine is concerned, it's likely that this conflict will put significant limits on how much American weaponry can be sent to Ukraine, which again favors the Russians. So the Russians actually look like a winner in this conflict. And I think the same thing is true with the Chinese. This will increase Chinese influence in the Middle East. It will increase Chinese influence around the world. They will look like a stable and reasonable regime compared to the Trump administration. So I think for those two countries, the other two great powers in the system, this war is a good thing.
John Mearsheimer, thank you for